Hello and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. As you can see, we're going to finish the lecture on World War II in the home front, but before we begin, as always, take a moment, hit pause on your screen, jot down the rest of the lecture outline, and pay attention to those key terms to the left. You ready? Let's get started. Now, we left off with talking about the economic demographic changes of World War II, as well as the influence of the U.S. government in this period. Now, however, socially, on the ground, yes, everyone's getting involved, but specifically, how do these different minority groups change as a result of World War II? And guys, seriously, the effects are dramatic for every one of these groups. Some good, some bad. And of course, everyone wants to start with women when it comes to World War II. Everyone remembers Rosie the Riveter. And that's very true. We can do it. Now, women flooded wartime industries. Again, they did in World War I also, but World War II was different. Because remember, in World War I, there were some kind of prerequisites. Young, single, no kids, right? During World War II, older married women are going to rush into the labor force as well. Over 6 million women will enter the workforce during World War II years. That's an increase of more than 50%. Women are doing tool makers, machinists, crane operators, lumberjacks, blacksmiths, railroad workers. They're building ships. In other words, traditional gender roles are kind of thrown out the window. Suddenly, it's always said, well, woman's role is in the kitchen, in the home, because that's what she's supposed to do. And she is the fairer sex who should not be able to do these things. But yet, during the war, she is indeed doing these things. Now, one more thing about this, though, that's very, very important, is, yes, there was a propaganda campaign, like Rosie the River explained, this is a woman's job. Do your part. Free a man for service. In other words, a woman takes a job, the man can go off to fight in the war now. This became a very popular propaganda. There's a problem, though. Whereas World War I was young, single women, no kids, no big deal, right? How does a married woman whose husband presumably is going off to war, who takes care of the kids? It's a valid question. And what we see here, obviously grandparents, that's an obvious answer. That's not always the case. Maybe the grandparents are dead. But what companies started to do for really the first time in history was open daycare centers. And in order for women to participate in the wartime industries, someone had to take care of the kids. And so really the 1940s is the first time in U.S. history when basically daycare is invented. It was a necessity, obviously, because someone had to watch the kids while women worked, because there was no other option to win this war. And so the thing is, after the war, daycares became a permanent fixture. Now, we'll discuss post-war culture in the next couple lectures. But it's very important to note that this creates a whole new phenomenon, a whole new idea that, well, if women work, they can if we create daycare centers. It becomes a whole new industry. Now, I would venture to guess that probably the vast majority of you listening to this probably went to daycare at some point in your life. It's become very, very common. And again, it basically started during World War II. Nonetheless, though, you see Rosie the River campaign. Not only are they involving themselves in the workforce, they were also doing part actually in the war. In fact, each of the branches of the military had a women's corps. Nearly 200,000 women served in the military, in the Women's Army Corps, the WAC, or the Navy's equivalent was the Women Accepted for Volunteer Emergency Service. I'm pretty sure they just wanted to figure out some way to use the acronym WAVES because it's the Navy. But each one of them had their branch. And women not serving in front lines, they're not necessarily out there shooting guns, but they are now being accepted into the military. Again, for the first time ever. So again, huge change in gender roles during World War II that America was acknowledging that women can do men's things and do so equally. So World War II becomes a turning point in the history of women. Something that they became much more, say, radicalized as a result that we'll talk about later. But again, for a good 20 years here, since women got the vote in 1920, women had kind of pulled back from politics a little bit. And World War II is really going to push them forward once again and get that yearning, that struggle for better equality. But women's role is not the sole solution to our labor problem. African Americans will also play a huge role in both the war abroad and at home. And much like World War I, African Americans will volunteer to serve, but also like during World War I, they will face extreme racial discrimination, prejudice, and segregation in their units. In addition, they will find that that businesses are not welcoming to them for wartime industries. In other words, hey, you built your GM plant building tanks. Doesn't mean you're going to now suddenly hire black people to work just because they're there. You're still going to be racist and discriminate against them. It got so bad. You think this, there's a labor shortage. There's African Americans who want to work, but we don't hire them because we're racist. It got so bad that in 1941, A. Philip Randolph, he's a labor leader. He's a black labor leader. He is going to organize a march on Washington and demand an end to racial discrimination, especially in the defense industry. Now, he wants it broadly, obviously, but at the very least, in wartime industry. Because remember, industry in World War II is not just a northern phenomenon. It's a western thing. It's a southern thing. There were huge, plane building plants in Alabama, which, of course, Jim Crow law is still in effect. And so he organizes this march on Washington to demand an end to racial segregation, racial discrimination in wartime industry specifically. And FDR, realizing this is a big deal, FDR, under just the threat of this organization or organized movement to march, FDR will strike a bargain with A. Philip Randolph and other black leaders, and he will actually issue an executive order that will, again, he's able to do this because of wartime necessity. He's able to use broader authority as president. And through the executive order, he will ban and eliminate discrimination against African Americans in the wartime industry. Now, is this a full equality thing? No, but it is an important step for African Americans. And again, it's going to get them even more ready to fight for civil rights in the next decade, right? So World War II becomes a springboard, a launching point for African Americans because abroad, they're saying, wait. We're fighting for democracy abroad here. We're fighting against the horrible atrocities of fascism. But yet we come back home and we're segregated. We can't even eat at lunch counters. We are told to go to the back of the kitchen to eat rather than sit down at restaurants. And so things like the proposed March on Washington, the discrimination and eventual success in being hired for wartime industries, for being segregated in separate black and white military units, but yet fighting the same Nazis, African Americans come back much more radicalized. How do we know this? Well, the NAACP, one of the premier civil rights organizations for African Americans, has been around since the late 1800s. They begin to support the Double V campaign. Yes, victory abroad, victory at home. Again, we need victory both because we're fighting against fascism abroad, but yet we had segregation and Jim Crow at home. But their membership, the NAACP membership, blossomed from 50,000 before the war to 450,000 by 1945. And then finally, in 1944, a landmark Supreme Court decision here in Texas, Smith versus Allwright. And again, so these are all victories for African Americans. Yes, they're still fighting for segregated units, but they come back more radicalized and ready to fight. They got the victory when it came to wartime defense production for discrimination in hiring practices. And then in 1944, finally. You see, here in Texas, there's what African Americans could vote legally, right? Ever since the 15th Amendment. They could legally vote. But what here in Texas they did was very, very terrible. They said, fine, you can vote in the election, but in the primary, so in the primary season, when we're going to select who's going to be on the ballot, you can't vote in that election. It's called the all-white primary. And so only whites were allowed to vote, which means you will never see an African American or a person of color elected to office, basically, because whites aren't going to vote them in from the primary ballots to be on the election in November. And because you don't have African Americans allowed to vote, you're not going to see that representation for their group. So again, huge Supreme Court decision in the midst of all this. So again, there is some progress being made, even though it is fairly limited to wartime things. Mexican Americans, Mexicans and Mexican Americans. Now see, we have tremendous racial tension in the West and North as a result of migration of African Americans, yes. But once again, as more and more rural Americans leave the rural areas and move to the urban centers and the cities, there's a labor shortage in agriculture, once again, much like World War I, particularly, of course, in the Southwest. To make up for this loss of farm labor, the United States created what was known as the Bracero Program in 1942. Now, bracero translates arm, but it basically means laborer, as far as the connotation of it. So you're working with your arms, you're working with your hands. So the goal of this program was that Mexico agrees, this is a joint international agreement. Now, it's fairly one-sided as far as the benefits on one hand, but it is, generally speaking, an agreement between Mexican government and the U.S. government. And what it did was Mexico agreed to send young men to work in the fields, so seasonal farm workers, in exchange that the American government would not force them into military service. So Mexico's not getting much out of this deal other than a promise. So these workers were hired on contracts. Now, these contracts could range anywhere from 4, 6 months, sometimes longer, sometimes up to a year. Most of the time they were short. And the idea was that you would come in the country from Mexico, and you would work the fields, and then you would go home. Now, there's a lot of stipulations to this. One being that you had to be basically a single male. Like you couldn't come as not that you couldn't be married, but you couldn't come as a family. You were coming by yourself. Some 200,000 farm workers from Mexico would enter the United States under this program. Now, what was the benefit? Why did Mexico agree to this, besides just helping the war? Because these braceros were paid for this. And during the late 40s, even in the 1950s, braceros began to send home upwards of $30 million a year back to family back in Mexico. So they came to the United States, they worked, they got paid, and they would send the money back to Mexico. And this is why the Mexican government would agree to this. Oh, by the way, fun fact, I love this fact. During the early 50s, when braceros were sending $30 million at home, that represented the third largest industry in Mexico. Think about it. Third largest industry in Mexico was not, oil. No, it was seasonal migrant laborers, braceros, sending money back from the United States. But that's the good, right? This is the good. It was a good program because people sent money back home. They made money. They had to see something new in the world, and it helped shore up our labor shortages in the labor market. True. But the implications of the Bracero program transformed and racialized the idea of Mexican into a commodity that can be bought, sold, imported, exported, that Mexicans themselves were not really necessarily humans, but rather seasonal stoop labor. Be brought in, used, and gotten rid of. The thing is, from the U.S. grower perspective, this was a godsend. These were single young men on contracts, which, by the way, theoretically is actually against U.S. law, but again, wartime. So these were single young men on a contract who were tied to one place, supposed to be tied to one farm for the duration of their contract, who would never be eligible for voting, never eligible for citizenship, and pretty much you could treat them pretty badly. There's no unions. In fact, they were actually forbidden from joining a union. And then they would be forced to stay in this substandard tract mobile housing that often lacked proper facilities. And if they tried to strike, you deport them. This is like the perfect labor source. There's the constant threat of deportation. They're never going to be U.S. citizens. They're not allowed to stay past their contract, which, fun fact, they often did. Because what would happen at the end of the contract, the owner of the farm would say, hey, you're doing pretty well there. We like having you here. You want to stick around longer? And the guy's like, sure. Now, he's supposed to go back to Mexico, sign a new contract, and come back again. That takes time, money, yeah. Just stay here. Of course, now here's an undocumented immigrant. Yeah. You're invited to. Why not? You're already here. You're making good money. The owner of the business wants you here. And of course, you're living on the constant threat of deportation. But hey, you got a good job. And once you're here off your contract, you can more easily float between 4 or 5 farms, or throughout the year, go to different states. While it's harvest time in, Texas right now, maybe it's, growing time in Texas, it's harvest time in Michigan. So travel across the country, why not? And so the result of this was a very, again, stereotyping Mexicans as nothing more than stoop laborers. And then it gets worse, because you get things like this. Now you see, here's the process. Let me go back up now for a minute. And here's the process of becoming a bracero. Now, first of all, the United States was allowed to set up these check stations in Mexico. And basically, they took out essentially soccer stadiums or bullfighting stadiums. They would have these Mexican men, prospective braceros, come to the stadium and wait all day to be checked over by various Americans. Again, labor contractors, businessmen, people basically hired to get laborers. And they would check their hands and say, because if they had soft hands, like they were someone who didn't work outside much, they would not be accepted as a bracero because, again, they only have a stereotypical mind that, oh, Mexicans must be this. They should not be wearing big flashy belts. They should be poor. They should be short so they can stoop over all day. They should have calloused hands from working in the fields. They have this mold, this stereotype. This is what a Mexican is. And anything that does not fit that mold, that stereotype mental idea, is rejected. And so then, after they passed the first stage, then they were taken into this room like you see pictured here. It's a big shower, right? And you're stripped naked, and you are deloused with DDT. Now, if you know what DDT is, it was a pesticide that was often put in things like mosquito repellent that later was determined to cause cancer. And so you'll also often see, it's just, they put it in various things. They sprayed fields with it, but it's a bad thing, cause cancer. But they sprayed people with it to delouse them because supposedly Mexicans were dirty. They were disease-ridden. Again, stereotypes placed upon Mexicans. In fact, here's what one bracero said. He said, quote, "Thousands came every day." To the stadiums, that is. "Once we got there, they'd send us in groups of about 200, as naked as we came into the world, into a big room about 60 feet square. And then men would come in mass with tanks on their backs, and they'd fumigate us from top to bottom. Supposedly, we were flea-bitten and germ-ridden," unquote. So these whites come in with masks and tanks and spray them all over with this chemical to clean them. But they themselves are wearing masks, so acknowledge that this is a dangerous environment to be in. Of course, what does this do for the American white perception of Mexicans? Well, it transforms the term Mexican, the category of Mexican, the person of Mexico, into a one-dimensional commodity, devalued to the point where the only way a Mexican has worth, value, and meaning is for their ability to pick crops. When you treat a group of people like this, where you stereotype them, you fumigate them because they're supposedly disease-ridden, you inspect them just to pick your fields because why? So everything that makes a person, their culture, their family, their political experience, their opinions, none of that mattered. Mexicans were transformed into monoculls or one-dimensional beings. They were laborers. In fact, they were stoop laborers, seasonal migrants who came and left and weren't worthy of becoming U.S. citizens. In other words, Mexicans and Mexican culture became the equivalent of seasonal stoop labor. That's all it was. Fun fact, by the way, actually I got two fun facts for you real quick. Number one is this, wartime program would last until 1964. Now, if history serves me correctly, the war ends in 45. So almost 20 years later, the program was still going on for wartime necessity. Yeah. Oh, second fun fact I promised to tell you is some people always ask, well, why didn't you just hire whites to do the job? They actually tried it. I have an article about it if anyone wants to, read it. They actually hired college kids to go pick the farms. Thousands of college kids were sent to the farms to pick the crops. Most of them lasted a week. And basically at that point, they all quit. They couldn't do it. Just too hot, too hard work. So, international program, make the Mexicans do it. The problem is, this transforms Mexicans into a commodity. And at the same time, it racializes not only people from Mexico, but it racializes and stigmatizes stereotypes Mexican Americans as well. And it creates new racial tension in the United States between Mexican Americans and whites. For example, there was a young man who had the privilege of hearing his interview. His name was Francisco Vega. Now, his nickname was Pancho. That's what all his friends called him. But Francisco Vega, who was one of the brave men who stormed the beaches of Normandy on D-Day, he was born in San Antonio in 1922. He was enrolled at an ROTC school. So again, this is someone who was involved in military type things from a very early age. Now at the school though, the faculty at the ROTC school forcibly changed his name. They said, Francisco, it's too Mexican. Don't like it. So they should change it. Now, I'm going to ask you this question. I know it's somewhat rhetorical, but what do you think they should change his name to? And of course, the answer I always get in class is Frank. I mean, it just makes sense. Francisco, call him Frank. Nah, his name's Mike. So all through his life as at ROTC school, all of his faculty calls him Mike. It sounds American? Sure, why not? So, Mike. Why not? Now, all of his life in the service, he knows Mike Vega. His friends called him Pancho. Now, let's flash forward now to December 7th, 1941. After hearing of the attack on Pearl Harbor, Vega's brother calls him from Mexico. and says, hey, quote, your country's just been attacked. You need to go volunteer and not wait, unquote. And so the next day, Pancho Vega, he goes down to the local recruitment office and enlists. Now, this is a person you would think they want immediately, right? A, he's volunteering. He's eager to. Secondly, this is a person who grew up in ROTC. Like, he has some experience with this. Like, he's a good candidate. But he was told by the recruitment office saying, quote, we are not taking Mexicans right now, unquote. Whoa, wait, hold on, what? First of all, he's not Mexican, he's Mexican-American. He's born in San Antonio. He's an American citizen. He went to an ROTC school and even had the strange white nickname of Mike by his faculty at ROTC school. But he's told, we're not taking Mexicans right now. He would go back numerous times, but denied each time. He would not be accepted until October of 1942, some 10 months later, despite growing up in an ROTC school. Now, he attributes this in his interview to that he is a darker complected person. He has darker skin naturally. And because he did say that there were other Mexican Americans who were accepted, but they usually had lighter skin. So yes, racism was alive and well in the military. So that's Francisco Vega's story. How Martin Morales, another gentleman I was able to hear his interview. He was an Air Force person. If I remember something correctly, he actually was working in training for the mission that would go on the atomic bomb mission. Like, he was actually training. And he's not the one who actually went to drop the bomb, but he was in the group that was training to learn how to drop the atomic bomb. But he was on leave from the Air Force in full uniform. And just outside Dallas, he went to a restaurant one night, and again, full military uniform. And the owner said that he was not permitted to sit at the restaurant in the dining area. However, if he really wanted food, he would have to order at the counter and then eat in the kitchen. Yes, so racism alive and well. Now, I'm not saying that the Bracero Program caused these things, because racism already existed. But the Bracero Program exacerbates these tensions. And it creates a more negative connotation for all people of Mexican descent, or anyone who actually speaks Spanish, because unfortunately, we don't generally discriminate in one thing. Anyone who speaks Spanish apparently is Mexican, according to most of our stereotypes, even though it's not really the case. But so anyone with darker skin who speaks Spanish was impacted by this racism that was only exacerbated by the Bracero Program. And I'm sad to say that the experiences of Martin Morales and Francisco Vega are not unique. This is across the board. They were segregated in the military. They were treated terribly at home. And those were individual instances in many times, but it was part of a larger problem that would boil over in 1943. Because in 1943, in Los Angeles, there would be what was called the Zoot suit riots. Now, what is a Zoot suit? You see, the Zoot suit, as you see pictured there, is a overly long suit that for many groups, originally African Americans and Mexican Americans began to borrow, especially Mexican American youth. And it usually involves slick back hair, and they were known as pachucos. And these pachucos, and also girls would also do it, females, who would usually slick back their hair as well, pachucas. And they would, wear these clothes, again, for style purposes. It was just their culture. Now, you might look at that and laugh now, but back in the 40s, this was their style. So be it. Their culture, their style. The problem with it was twofold. One is, they were Mexican Americans. So there was a stigma against them already. And what made it worse to many whites was they looked at these Zoot suits and said, that is an overabundance of cloth. I mean, these are, baggy, they're long. The suit coats themselves are extra long. They should be, according to white standards. And they said, this is a wartime. You're supposed to be conserving things, everything, including cloth. And so whites would use the Zoot suits as a point of contention. Now, please note, this is both ways, because these youth, like many of you, do not like getting made fun of. They don't take it lying down. And so in Los Angeles, 1943, these flamboyant clothes became a flashpoint, the Zoot suit. And during 1943, several thousand off-duty sailors and soldiers who were stationed in Los Angeles, they would go from the docks where their camp was into the city of Los Angeles. And while they were there, they would exchange threats, insults, again, back and forth with the Mexican-American youths. Well, it finally boils over to the point in 1943 where several thousand off-duty sailors and soldiers, joined by several hundred just white civilians, begin to start a riot. They begin to beat up these Mexican-American youths. They stripped them of their clothes because this was, that identity, that Zoot suit, flashpoint. You see them there on the ground. And these riots would last a week in Los Angeles. And in the midst of it, wasn't just Mexican Americans getting attacked. It was Filipinos. It was African Americans. It was a full-blown race riot. All because they didn't like what kind of clothes they're wearing. And again, this is a topic I would love to spend more time on. But unfortunately, this is a survey course. So if you want to learn more about Zoot suits, please take a good Mexican American Studies course. This is a fascinating topic you could spend, again, a whole week or two on. But we need to move on to the next group, which is the Chinese. Now, you might remember, we haven't had a very great relationship with the Chinese, have we? I mean, we wanted to sell stuff to them, yes. We like the open door policy. We wanted to sell them lots of stuff, including cigarettes. But remember, they were also the first group to be made illegal as immigrants, right? They were the first group to ever be banned by the United States back to 1882. However, the United States finally realized, the Chinese are our allies in fighting against the Japanese here. Maybe it's not the smartest thing to do to keep banning them from coming to our country. We need them to help us. And so finally, in 1943, the United States will repeal the Chinese Exclusion Act and finally welcome in Chinese again. Yay! Celebrate! Oh, wait, sorry. One problem. The inspector, the director in charge of issuing visas for immigration in Hong Kong, he was very racist. And he would arbitrarily and harshly deny prospective Chinese immigrants for various odd reasons. He would deny, suspend, and even put in limbo those who applied for visas. For example, he would actually go into their homes and search them and say, I can't approve your visa because your entire family here does not have the same blood type. Now, I have a PhD. I'm a doctor. I am not an MD. But even I know that families do not always have the same blood type. That is not a prerequisite. My wife and I do have the same blood type. I have a different blood type than my father has. Doesn't make him not my dad. But again, they were finding any way. So even though the restrictions were lifted, there was still not like a floodgate opening for Chinese immigration. But propaganda-wise, it sounded good. And it sounded great for all of 6 years. So 1943, exclusion ends. But 1949 was the communist takeover in China. And once again, we will start excluding Chinese again. We were going to cut diplomatic relations because they turned communist. So short-lived. So let's see. Women did pretty well in the war. African Americans did much better. Mexican Americans, well, yes, there were some job opportunities for Mexican Americans. That was true. And Mexicans definitely saw some financial benefits of the Bracero Program, but also harsh stereotypes. Chinese had a brief respite, didn't last long and didn't work that well. But then there's the worst group, the Japanese. And the Japanese are going to face the harshest parts of World War II as any other group. compared to any other group. Because one group in particular, of course, is hugely, very negatively impacted: Japanese Americans. Remember, who was the group who attacked Pearl Harbor? Well, Japan did. And after Pearl Harbor, there's an extreme anti-Japanese sentiment. Now, other groups did too. Italian Americans, because Mussolini, yep. German Americans, yep. But the worst group by far was Japanese Americans, because the hated Japanese are the ones who bombed Pearl Harbor. In fact, the governor of Idaho was quoted as saying, quote, "A good solution to the Jap problem would be to send them all back to Japan and then sink the island," unquote. Yes, anti-Japanese hostility was alive and well, and again, extreme racism, prejudice against Japanese and Japanese Americans. Remember, Japan or Japanese immigration has been pretty much banned since 1907. So there's not a ton, but the ones who are here are largely long-time American citizens, sometimes second, third, fourth generation Americans. But yet they're being seen as hostile, they're being seen as suspect, as potential spies, because their loyalty must be to Japan because they're Japanese. But they maybe haven't been in Japan. Nonetheless, in response to this, the president, FDR, will issue Executive Order 9066. You see the date, 1942, which orders for the removal of Japanese Americans from their home to war relocation camps. Again, definitely not concentration camps. That's what Hitler does. We used war relocation camps. So Executive Order 9066. And you see, Americans were worried about Japanese Americans inside the country, fear of them spying. But don't worry, some people did question whether or not this was legal or not. You know, can the president really do this? Can you remove Americans from their home forcibly and put them into relocation camps? Well, apparently the Supreme Court said yes, because there's an very old act in our nation's history back in 1798. Remember Adams had the Alien Sedition Acts? Yeah, those things. So the Enemy Aliens Act was still on the books, and it gave the executive branch broad authority to, quote, summarily apprehend, restrain, secure, or remove all non-U.S. citizen natives, denizens, or subjects of a hostile government, unquote. Now, I would interpret that as being, well, at the very least, you can't take Japanese Americans out of their home because they're Americans. But they took that very loosely and said they're subjects of a hostile government. Their loyalties must be with Japan. And so out of this great fear, the Supreme Court upholds it, and they will be forcibly remove first and second generation Japanese immigrants into these relocation camps, and then relocate them from their homes to these camps to makeshift housing. Again, definitely not concentration camps. And the U.S. government, they will never formally strip Japanese of their citizenship. But yet the very notion that they are being forcibly removed and thrown into these war relocation camps, that is negating their citizenship. It nullifies their citizenship. They're losing their rights without even being charged with a crime. There's no crime. They just presume that all Japanese in America were inclined to disloyalty based on race, culture maybe even. All told, the United States will remove 120,000 Japanese Americans. Let me rephrase that. 120,000 total people of Japanese descent. 80,000 were U.S. citizens. And while they're in these war relocation internment camps, they will do things like work They will grow crops. Have some labor they have to perform while they're there. So they get fed. And of course, when they're forced out of their homes and relocated to these non-concentration camps, they are forced to sell their land, their farms, their businesses for pennies on the dollar, which whites quickly bought up. And then they were transported to these poor makeshift houses. And remember, the goal here is to get them as far away from the coast as popular, or as far away from the coast as they possibly could, right? Because they're worried about spying. But yet, most of them are still on the West Coast. So again, this became a way to steal land and relegate Japanese as inferiors. There's even said that while you're in the camp, you might be given a loyalty questionnaire. Now, people spoke about civil rights here, but seriously, that the Supreme Court said, no, it's legal. It's wartime. But there was a loyalty questionnaire that many men were given that said, hey, will you renounce any ties to Japanese citizenship? Remember, there were some that were Japanese citizens still, but they were about 40,000 of them. The problem with doing that, I mean, on the one hand, the answer should be, well, yes, I'll give up my Japanese citizenship by all means to prove loyalty, right? That makes sense. But think about this from their perspective. These 40,000 that were known as isi, that these were the Japanese citizens still. Japanese were not eligible for U.S. citizenship. Now, if you're born here, it's one thing. But if you were an immigrant, you were not eligible for U.S. citizenship if you were Japanese. So that means if you were to renounce your Japanese citizenship, you will be a stateless individual with no government to ever help you. That's a scary place to be in. On the other hand, there's another question that said, hey, especially the citizens, they said, hey, would you join the army and fight for the United States? So they're asking you to prove your loyalty. Join the army. Which, of course, I mean, if you don't want to, or you realize it'll hurt your family stuck here in this poor internment camp. But if you say no, you're immediately seen as a suspect. But if you say yes, you break up your family. You risk death, obviously. And of course, they're not going to put you anywhere near the actual fighting because they don't trust you. You're being segregated units once again. One man explained it in his own words, saying, quote, one Japanese man, that is, Japanese American, says, quote, they got me. The American government threw me in a concentration camp. His words. Labeled me dangerous because I wouldn't declare my loyalty. Intimidated me and subjected me to extreme mental and physical stress. In fact, the government did such a good job of manipulating me, I gave away my U.S. citizenship voluntarily. Now they can deport me to Japan without any trouble at all, I realized, unquote. It was not until 1983 that the government finally recognized the injustice of throwing Japanese and Japanese Americans into these concentration camps. I'm sorry, they may not have been Hitler-style camps, death camps, but when you're forcibly removed from your home and relocated, you are forced to work where you're, as the man described, quote, subjected to extreme mental and physical stress. That is a concentration camp. Finally, in 1983, the government would recognize the injustice and grant $20,000 in reparation to the internment survivors, which is a small drop in the bucket considering they lost everything. So how do we conclude this? Well, American society was in a dramatic state of upheaval. Racial tension exploded despite having some positive gains for women. The Great Depression came to an end, but the war is also going to come to an end with this. And on August 6, 1945, World War II will come to an end as we drop the atomic bomb. on Japan. In fact, we'll drop 2 of them. But that is something that we will talk about in our next lecture, including the debate over, is it even moral to drop the atomic bomb and to use it because of the great devastation it causes? But that is a debate for our next lecture. So until then, take care and bye-bye.